Did you know that the reason you exist today is because one doctor was thrown into a psychiatric asylum? And what I'm about to tell you, I almost didn't believe it myself when I first found this story. You're going to think this is insane. You're going to think this is impossible, because what this man was punished for is today the most basic, most common, most obvious thing that exists in every hospital on earth. Let that sink in for a second. He didn't lose his mind. He didn't break the law. He told his colleagues to wash their hands, and for that, they locked him away. They didn't fail by accident. They chose ego over lives, and by the end of this video, you will never look at the word institution the same way again. Vienna, 1844, the most prestigious medical city on earth. And I want you to really picture this, because it matters. These were not incompetent men. These were the best doctors in the world, educated, respected, celebrated, the kind of men who wrote papers, gave lectures, had their portraits painted. And inside their hospital, the largest hospital on earth, women were dying at a rate that would be considered a war crime today. 1 in 3. Stay with me, because this next part is where it gets truly disturbing. 1 in 3 women who gave birth in Ward 1 died within 48 hours. The condition was called childbed fever. Puerperal fever, right next door, same building, same hospital, same patients, was Ward 2. Ward 2 was run by midwives, not doctors. Their mortality rate? Less than 4%. The women of Vienna knew this. Pregnant women would beg on their knees not to be sent to Ward 1. Some gave birth in the streets rather than enter that ward. Think about that for a second. Women in 1847. Vienna trusted the streets more than they trusted their doctors. And what did the medical establishment say? They blamed the victims. They said women in Ward 1 were more anxious. That anxiety caused the fever. And here is the part that should make you stop and think. Because it didn't happen by accident. They didn't fail by accident. They chose ego over lives. I've read a lot of dark history. But this specific detail, blaming patient anxiety for deaths that doctors were causing, this one stays with me. And I think it should stay with you too. Ignaz Semmelweis was 29 years old when he arrived at that hospital. Hungarian, intense, the kind of man who couldn't let a question die. He wasn't sleeping. He was going home every night and coming back with more questions, more notes, more obsession. His colleagues thought he was difficult. His superiors found him exhausting. He didn't care, because women were dying, and he couldn't accept that nobody was asking why. He checked everything. Birth position, time of day, diet, nationality, weather patterns. He eliminated every variable he could think of. Nothing explained it. And then, in March 1847, something happened that changed everything. Not a discovery, a death. His friend, Professor Jakob Kolečka, a man Semmelweis respected deeply, was accidentally cut by a student's scalpel during an autopsy. Within days, Kolečka was gone. When Semmelweis read the autopsy report, he froze. The symptoms were identical to childbed fever. The fever, the inflammation, the rapid progression, identical. He began to doubt himself. He read the report again, and again he knew what it meant. But he also knew what it would cost him to say it out loud. And in that moment, standing alone in a corridor of the Vienna General Hospital, he made a decision that would destroy his career, his reputation, and eventually his life. He decided to tell the truth. Pay attention to this. Every morning, doctors and medical students began their day in the autopsy room. They cut open cadavers. They pressed their bare hands into decomposing tissue, and then, without washing their hands, they walked directly into the maternity ward and examined pregnant women. No gloves, no protocol, no hesitation. They were carrying death from the dead directly into the living, every single day. Semmelweis called it cadaverous particles. We now call it bacterial contamination. The midwives in Ward 2 never touched cadavers. That was the entire difference. That was the only reason 1 in 3 women was dying in Ward 1, while Ward 2 recorded barely 4%. The doctors were killing their patients unknowingly, with their own hands. But here's where it gets even darker. Because the solution was not complicated, Semmelweis introduced one rule: wash your hands in a chlorinated lime solution before entering the maternity ward. April 1847. Before the rule, mortality rate 18.3%. 2 months later, 2.2%. By the end of the year, 0 deaths, 0. He had the proof. He had the numbers. He had solved it. And now, pay close attention, because what happened next is not a story from 1847. It is a story about right now. They didn't fail by accident. They chose ego over lives. Semmelweis presented his findings to the medical establishment of Vienna. He had the data. He had the results. He had months of undeniable evidence, and they rejected him, not because the numbers were wrong, because of what accepting those numbers would mean. If Semmelweis was right, then every senior physician in that hospital had spent years killing patients with their own unwashed hands. Men of status, men of reputation, men with portraits on walls and books with their names on the cover. Accepting Semmelweis meant accepting that they were responsible for thousands of deaths, so they didn't accept it. Professor Charles Meigs, one of the most respected obstetricians in Europe, dismissed everything with one sentence: doctors are gentlemen, and gentlemen's hands are clean. Thousands of women dead, evidence on the table, and his answer was about social class. This is not stupidity. This is something far worse than stupidity. They didn't fail by accident. They chose ego over lives. Semmelweis was removed from his position, sent back to Budapest in disgrace. But here's what they didn't expect. In Budapest, same rule, same protocol. Mortality rates fell immediately. Again, he published a 543-page book in 1861, documented everything, every number, every death, every proof. It was ignored. And I want to ask you something directly. Leave your answer in the comments. Was Charles Meigs a villain? Or was he a product of a system that made it impossible to accept the truth? Because I think the answer to that question tells you everything about the world we live in today. By 1865, Semmelweis was 47 years old. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't eating properly. He was writing letters, desperate, angry, increasingly broken, to obstetricians across Europe, calling them murderers, because that's what they were. Was he wrong? No. Was his approach working? Also, note he knew he was right. He had always known. But 18 years of being ignored while women continued to die from something he had already solved. 18 years of that breaks a person. In July 1865, his wife and colleagues had him committed to a mental asylum in Vienna. 2 weeks later, he was dead. Official cause: septicemia. Blood poisoning from a wound on his hand. The leading theory among historians: he was beaten by the asylum guards and died from the infection in his wounds. He died from the same type of infection he had spent his entire life trying to prevent. He never knew he was right. He died believing he had failed, inside the walls of an asylum, surrounded by people who thought he was mad. Ignaz Semmelweis took his last breath without ever knowing that his discovery would save hundreds of millions of lives. They didn't fail by accident. They chose ego over lives, and it cost him everything. 14 years after his death, Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister confirmed germ theory. The medical world finally accepted what one Hungarian doctor had discovered in 1847 and spent the rest of his life being punished for. Today, there is a term in medicine called the Semmelweis reflects the automatic, instinctive rejection of new information that contradicts what an institution already believes, named after him. As a warning, and here is my honest opinion, the Semmelweis reflex didn't end in 1865. It didn't end when germ theory was accepted. It is alive right now, in institutions you trust, in systems that protect their reputation before they protect you. I'm not telling you which ones. I'm asking you to think about it, because the real lesson of Ignaz Semmelweis is not about handwashing. It's about what happens to the person who tells an uncomfortable truth to a comfortable institution. They didn't fail by accident. They chose ego over lives. Drop your answer in the comments. Was Charles Meigs a villain or a victim of the system he served? I read every single one. There is a file that took me 3 days to finish reading. Not because it was long, because of what was inside it. A doctor who cured a disease that was killing thousands. His colleagues didn't just ignore him, they erased him. His name was almost lost forever. Almost. This archive posts 2 to 3 times a week. Don't be the last to know.